Hello. Today I will be going over sexual and reproductive health in Lebanon. I will be focusing on the Syrian refugee crisis and how this has affected the female refugees. This is my Cultural Solutions project, and this is for a class of cultural aspects of health behavior. I want to start off by looking at gender inequalities as a global issue. Consideration of gender inequality and its importance for health is far from new. Women's rights movements, feminist scholars, and like-minded professionals have been agitating for gender equality in the context of global health and the development for decades. You can see that there's a picture of hands, something that we all have, most of us, I should say. Please take a minute, observe your hands. Look at the left, look at the right. One might think that they are the same, yet their position and function in relation to the body are not neutral. Around the world, the left and right hands are viewed and valued differently. There is an enormous cultural variability depending on the culture itself. For example, phrases such as left hand dominant can hold meaning of being sinister, and that comes from the Latin word for left. Somehow it makes it better to be right-handed in that context. These terms are not unique to the English language, but they reflect and reinforce the differential value system. Gender stereotypes can reflect upon what is considered feminine or masculine, but somehow it always follows the profound hierarchy that masculine is superior to feminine. It's not really understood, but somehow this gender system continues to shape our lives and the world. The insight and understanding of that and how gender inequality and restrictive gender norms lead to inequalities in health and how the persistent discrepancies can be only allows us to change it and make it better. Some insight that I found to be very helpful is knowing that because of this historical gender injustice, the health-related consequences of gender inequality fall most heavily on women, especially poor women. By contrast, rigid gender norms undermine the health and well-being of all people. So for me, what that points out is that women suffer the most, especially poor women. Moving on, we're looking at these female refugees in Lebanon. Gender equalities do exist. However, these women have been able to find some coping strategies. First of all, they're displaced from their homes. This has been since 2011. Every 2 seconds, somewhere in the world, a man, a woman, child, they're forced to flee their lives due to war, persecution, and other human rights violations. Since the Syrian civil war broke out in 2011, nearly 500,000 people have been killed in conflict. Half of the remaining Syrians, which comes out to be about 13.5 million, need humanitarian assistance, and nearly 1 in 5 of those citizens have fled their country to survive. 24% of these refugees are women between the ages of 18 to 59. In March 2015, the United Nations Population Fund estimated that nearly 500,000 Syrian women are pregnant. They are residing both in Syria and their host nations like Lebanon. Out of that percentage, 70,000 of them would experience complications associated with pregnancy and delivery. Gender power differentials directly affect the reproductive health of women by interfering in their autonomous decisions about their bodies, controlling their access to resources and services. Syrian women are going without basic health care for female sexual health and reproduction. The significant relationship between violence and reproductive health is high. So they're witnessing violence, they're experiencing violence, and this correlates to a negative decline in their sexual health and in their reproductive health. Not only that, they are witnessing things and it's increasing mental health issues. There is a need for support with mental health along with reproductive health and sexual health services for these women in Lebanon. There have been numerous reports of sexual violence noted during the Syrian crisis. In Lebanon, the cultural foundations of their religion make it difficult for Syrian refugees to talk about these violent acts. They're fearful about what will happen if and when they do. Marriage is occurring at a young age that has emerged as a coping strategy of these Syrian refugees living in Lebanon. Teens, younger girls are getting married and having families. It's thought that if they get married young, that will offer them protection for not only them, their well-being, but also for their family. And then not only that, they assume that they will be provided for, so they don't have to worry about working as much because now they're married and it would fall on the husband to do that. However, early marriage can be associated with poor knowledge of family planning methods. There are higher maternal risks when teens are getting pregnant at such a young age, and there are also poor pregnancy outcomes because they're not aware of what is needed to have a healthy pregnancy. Amidst the Syrian crisis, there have been many unwanted sexual relationships occurring in refugee camps in Lebanon. This combination with young brides breeds the fear that their ability to request information about contraceptions may cause harm to them. There have been studies that said that when these young girls go to their husband and ask for contraceptive support so they don't have children, they are met with a strong no because of religious preferences and or their opinion doesn't matter. And then to follow up on that, there's domestic violence disputes after females requesting contraceptive support. Moving on to the medical system. Lebanese women versus Syrian refugees. Everybody needs medical care. So what happens when there's tremendous amount of Syrian refugees flooding Lebanon? These Lebanese females were receiving care now have this inability to continue with their medical services. So looking at the medical care in Lebanon, the health system was flooded with Syrian refugees. This extremely taxed the medical providers. One study looked at the wear and tear this inflicted upon the nurses. With the overall burdened medical system, Lebanese women of the host nation were unable to continue their medical needs. Nurses and nursing directors reported that Syrian refugees' health profile was at a poor state at its baseline, so they're coming in with lower health. As the crisis continued, the type of diseases shifted from acute, small issues and grew to be chronic with building complications. Other outlined determinants of health for Syrian refugees, especially for females, it was noted that they have poor literacy health and obviously they have poor living conditions. Nurses and nursing directors voiced their concerns of the impact of all these Syrian refugees in the medical system, but it also brought crisis for the nurses. There was issues with the nursing practice and the healthcare practice, the healthcare system, and the host community. Nurses are experiencing burnout, fatigue, and depleted compassion. And when I say that depleted compassion, they're unable to care for their patients as they should. They're not able to find the need to support them because they don't have anything left to give. It was also noted that nurses reported stress in their interpersonal relationships at home, also in their professional interpersonal relationships in practice. So they have nothing left to give. There's a shortage of resources, as one can imagine. With that, it just delivers a poor performance of healthcare. There was also a shift in the patient population. So those that were receiving care stopped seeking services at that facility and either went elsewhere or just stopped getting the medical care that they needed. What really stuck out to me was in this one study, it highlighted when money was injected into the healthcare system, new services and clinical programs were introduced. I wanted to highlight that fact because for me that's most important. Money does change what's going on. The Syrian refugee crisis, especially females not being able to receive care, is not something that is fixable with a little bit of money to work on a project. It is a global issue. However, money is out there, money is available, and it was being interjected into this problem. Moving on, I want to focus on what has happened with the Syrians and the host nation of Lebanese in their ability to welcome them. I know I had previously mentioned, but this Syrian crisis has been going on since 2011. These displaced Syrians have left their homes and have been living in refugee camps since 2011. Similarly to what was mentioned with healthcare, with the nurses, there's a decline in compassion for all those that are displaced. Lebanon was once welcoming as they have dealt with their own civil issues in the past, but because this has been elongated for so long, they're running out of empathy. People are losing patience and they're losing that concern that they had for those victims who have been displaced. Lebanon is also fearful that this addition of population will take away services and already scarce resources. Lebanon has many cities, some of them are flourishing, but then when you go along the coast to the borders, there's a lot of poor nations. So everybody's fighting for these resources. There have been debates about immigration policy, and it has sparked more negative attitudes towards these refugees, particularly those of Muslim identification. Research to date has found that these post-immigration prejudice and discrimination stories and experiences often reinforce a negative psychological burden on these refugees. So not only are they fighting for survival, they know that they're not wanted, and that's playing on their mental psyche on a regular basis. Nevertheless, every day in Lebanon, it's not conceptualized as a safe zone. Fighting is still going on. Refugees are increasingly being used as scapegoats for the poor economy in Lebanon and the political challenges in the country. While practices of hospitality towards the Syrian refugees were widespread in the beginning, ambivalent feelings and prejudice frequently surface now. Refugees expressed concern that the Syrian civil war would escalate into further violence in Lebanon, pushing the country closer to war. Hospitality is an interesting thing. It's a special kind of gift that involves temporarily sharing of space, time, bodies, food, and other consumables. Hospitality may be perceived as potentially dangerous in the economic term because it involves the sharing of these sacred resources, these scarce resources. Although guests in practice can be productive and contribute to the economy. So the Syrians are trying to get jobs, they're trying to find ways to earn money and be valuable in the community. However, with these prejudices, they're not being hired. They'd rather give the money back to a Lebanese individual. Lebanon's hospitality to the Syrian guests is showing its signs of strain as refugee flows put pressure on or are perceived as influencing the country's economy. So you can see this goes way deep. Moving on, now that we have an understanding of what's going on, let's focus on the solution. What is the solution to this problem? I wanted to focus on bringing education to the females because that's where this starts. I could have went on for hours about the complexities of the lack of female healthcare in sexual health and in reproductive health. But I kept it general so that way you get a better understanding. But baseline, I want to create a target team of 5 individuals that will go and get embedded in one of the refugee communities. I want to focus on one that's in a poor area where there's not a lot of awareness. This focus team will educate females young and old on sexual health and reproductive health care. I want them to inform these females in the community about what's available and how they can receive these services. In addition, this was my little heart project. I want to offer a shuttle service, and I don't mean daily shuttle service because transportation is not a good thing in Lebanon. But I would like to create a transportation system one day a week where females can be taken to and from these clinics. This is just to promote a feeling of safety and awareness. Because the Syrian crisis has put a tremendous strain on the Lebanese healthcare system, the International Committee of Red Cross, the ICRC, found ways to lower medical care costs for individuals and their need of care. There's been a lot of focus on female reproductive health because many females were not being seen at all during their pregnancy. The ICRC wanted to ensure that these services were reaching some of their more vulnerable populations. Just to break it down, there's a lot of money being put into this community. They know that there was a need for a humanitarian health response, so they worked with the Ministry of Public Health, supported with the World Health Organization, the United Nations Commissioner for Refugees, and they were also working with non-governmental organizations to ensure the widest possible coverage for this situation. What it really came down to is that money is there, but it's not being utilized because lack of awareness was cited as the biggest reason by the ICRC for people not attending appointments or utilizing services. They found that it was 54%. So that's huge. Half the population doesn't even know that there's healthcare available at cost. So if people are avoiding being seen because it's too expensive, that takes away that logic. But like I said, many of them don't know. So how do we achieve this? The solution goals. I want to increase awareness of the available programs to the healthcare services, for healthcare services, that is. I want to measure my progress based on the number of appointments that are now happening, that will happen at clinics, and I will have the target team in the community giving surveys, taking surveys. I want to use the embedded focus team to educate females in the community, only to then have those females educate other females. We only have 1 year to achieve this 30% increase in healthcare services in this area. So I need to educate females to educate other females. And then based on the research, there is a need that females are not receiving information on sexual health, they're not receiving reproductive health care in any way. I know I mentioned this, but again, Lebanon is a highly privatized place for medical care, and it's usually more expensive. However, these programs are already in existence. I am not recreating the wheel. I want to touch on what's already there and have them flowed into the supportive care services that are there. So educating females on their bodies, right? It's there. And it's a delicate situation with religion and everything that plays into this culture, but I want to be that paragon of strength for these women. The question now is, how do we get this done? How do we complete it? Well, for 1 year, my target team will reside in the refugee community. They're going to seek out females. They're going to get to know everybody in their community because it will be their community for a year. Once there's a comfortability factor and the target teams are speaking to women in the community, the hope is that they will come and do a female-oriented group. Maybe meetings will start once a week, maybe it's once a month. It just depends on the interest and how much buy-in we get from these females, but that can be adjusted as needed. Educational material will be available for those who are interested. Since literacy is low, it is assumed that it will mostly be done through communication, but eventually the hope is that the females start talking to the other females. I want to be a movement for them to talk to each other. And since we don't have that much time educating females to educate other females, I'm looking for some volunteers, some workers in the community that can continue educating other females when the target team departs. And that's another important piece to the puzzle, because how do you continue to keep volunteers motivated? One study said that you need to make it personal for them. It needs to be motivating for them on an individual level, their family level. And so something that I thought to be important was offering a stipend. So having the ability to deliver a stipend to those few volunteers that continue on with this educational growth. All right, so transportation. I loved this idea. It's not about getting them to or from, so to speak, but more about offering the safety of their awareness. Transportation is an issue in Lebanon. There's not taxis, there's not buses. And many people live in the city of Beirut, and that's where 50% of most transportation occurs. We're not going to be there, so it doesn't really offer much insight. But I thought to contract with a vehicle service like a shuttle bus, maybe a van would be a better way to describe it. But one day a week, being able to transport these women to a clinic. One of the clinics that subsidize healthcare at a lower cost. That way they know where it's at. That way they're not independently walking on their own, even if that was an option. This way they can do it together. The hope is to promote safety as well. I think about me in my life doing things on my own versus doing it with a group. It feels better, it feels more comfortable in a group. So bringing these women together. And then looking at the budget was pretty simplistic. I have 2 slides. So the first slide is an estimate of my income that I have received. Thus far, we're starting with $10,000. I have been lucky enough and received that money from the Liberty Health Mission Board. Grants are being worked on as we speak. I'm waiting to hear back on one that was submitted. But you see that there's places to receive further donations, financial backing from other investors, and anything else that may come up for us to receive money to support these women. Budgeting estimates. Since we're not there yet, it's still an estimate, but I broke it down as much as I could. It becomes pretty simple. So my target team will be volunteers themselves, and they're going to be residing in the refugee community. There's not a lot of cost in that. And they are providing their own finances to support this solution-focused goal because they're also working on their own personal research. That means that the $10,000 goes directly to the solution goal of supporting these females in their sexual health and reproductive health. So as you see it on there, $2,000 will be used in creating educational materials that can be passed out into the community. They'll have clinic locations, clinic phone numbers, as well as the material on female sexual health and reproductive health. There'll also be translations, some in Lebanese, some in different languages that are of need. And as I mentioned, with transportation, I will be working to figure out a contract with a vehicle service one day out of the week for a year, right? Just picking up females at the refugee camps and taking them to the clinic or clinics that provide care at cost. So $3,000 has been set aside for that transportation. I found that to be very valuable. $1,000 was set aside for office supplies, materials that might be needed. We'll see what happens. And then a telephone. So having a telephone with my target group so they can offer that to the females in the refugee community. $1,000 for that for the year. So maybe they need to schedule appointments. Maybe they need to figure out a problem that's happening. They will have a phone and access to it. Lastly, $3,000 has been set aside as the amount that can be divvied up for the stipend delivery at the end of our year there. So it'll be split up between however many volunteers we're able to find, and then they will receive those funds. Money is tight. $10,000 is a great amount, but it doesn't leave a lot of room for error. But there's strength, and we're motivated to do this. Like I said, we're not recreating the wheel. We're just trying to get information into the community for these female Syrian refugees so they can get the care that they deserve. I want to end with a quote, and let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. not giving up meeting together, and some are in the habit of doing, but encouraging one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. We'll see what happens. Thank you so much. Have a good day.